Thanks to everyone for coming today. It's nice to see some familiar faces in the audience. And I appreciate your support. And I was particularly pleased to see that a number of head teachers and other colleagues from local schools, academies and colleges were on the attendance list. And others saying that they couldn't make it but will watch the video. I'm not sure that I'll be watching the video. I do hope my voice holds out. I've been suffering from a bout of the man flu and spoke for an hour at the University's Council for the Education of Teachers conference on Tuesday, and it didn't really hold out for the duration. So we've turned the mic up and I'm speaking in as softly voice as I can to try and get it over the line. But if I'm mumbling at any point and you can't hear me, if you could perhaps cup your hands to your ear there at the back, then I might take the hint. I'm slightly embarrassed that, as David said, I joined the university in January 2014 and I'm only now giving my inaugural lecture. But in a recent conversation with Lorraine Harrison, who most of you will know as the former head of School of Education, we thought that now might be a particularly good time, a good moment to talk about mentoring and the potential impact that mentoring can have for individuals and for organisations, and to stimulate some thinking about how best to make that happen, to realise some of those benefits. For example, you'll see there in the context of early career teachers in schools, in July 2016 we saw the publication, as David just mentioned, of the first national standards for school-based ITT, initial teacher training mentors. And I was consulted, as David said, on the development of those standards, but as will become clear, I profess, and I thought I ought to say that once, given the occasion, that the standards don't go far enough to help maximise the potential benefits of mentoring. And in at least one respect, they threaten to do more harm than good. Secondly, in the context of this institution, in which many of us are employed, we recently introduced some research mentoring framework at the university, which was informed by some research that some of us undertook with Chrysalis Research. And Tom Leavesley was hoping to get along today. Are you here, Tom? Can't see him. He's director of Chrysalis. And the introduction of this mentoring framework to support the career development of researchers, along with other mechanisms and opportunities for mentoring within the university, is great news given the range of positive impacts that mentoring can have on mentees, mentors and organisations, including enhancing students' and colleagues' learning, development and career progression. And one of the things about mentoring is that, done well, it doesn't only bear fruit for the duration of a particular mentoring relationship, it can help bring about sustainable change. One, because it can support individuals' development of what Guy Claxton calls learnacy, which is individuals' ability to go on learning from their own and others' experiences over time, long after a mentoring relationship is finished. But secondly, because those individuals who've benefited from mentoring are then in an ideal place to become mentors and role models to the next generation of mentees. In the words of the UK mentoring guru David Clutterbuck, who some of you may have heard of, everyone needs a mentor. That was the title of his book. The subtitle was Fostering Talent in Your Organisation. And this lecture is primarily about fostering and nurturing talent in schools and colleges, whilst there are also some lessons for fostering and nurturing talent in other types of organisation, such as universities. But the mere introduction of a mentoring scheme and assignment of mentors will not necessarily foster and nurture talent in our organisations and bring about the various potential benefits that mentoring can bring. So if I might qualify the words of my learned colleague, Professor Clutterbuck, everyone needs or would benefit from a good mentor. Nobody needs a bad mentor. Let me quickly offer some signposting so you can see where this is going. After defining some of the key terms, I'll provide a brief outline of the research that informs the arguments and claims that I'm going to present to you. Next, I'll provide an overview of what might be called the research problem that I'm going to address, which is that mentoring for early career teachers in schools and colleges has failed and is failing to realise its potential. Henceforth, early career teachers will be abbreviated as ECTs if you could remember that. There are only 2 abbreviations, I think, that you need to remember. And I go on to explore some of the reasons for this failure, focusing on those associated with what I call judgementoring. In the last main section of the lecture, I then present a new and alternative framework for mentoring that I call ONSIDE Mentoring, before finally offering some concluding remarks. So since this lecture focuses on mentoring for early career teachers, I should tell you what I understand and mean by both mentoring and early career teachers. I'll explain the meaning of judgementoring and ONSIDE a little later. I should acknowledge that there's lack of agreement over the meaning of the term mentoring and about what mentoring should seek to achieve. My own working definition of mentoring in this context, that is its use with early career teachers, incorporating what I believe it should achieve, is provided here. A one-to-one relationship between a relatively inexperienced teacher and a relatively experienced teacher, which aims to support the mentee's learning, development and well-being and their integration into the cultures of both the organisation and the wider profession. It's probably obvious, but I'll state for the sake of clarity that I'm dealing today with the practice of one-to-one mentoring as a formal arrangement, in which individuals are specifically designated to undertake the mentoring role. That's not to suggest that group mentoring or informal mentoring, in which colleagues provide support for others and each other outside of formal arrangements, or indeed peer mentoring, where colleagues mentoring each other have similar levels of experience and expertise, are not also valuable means of supporting the professional learning, development and well-being of early career teachers. And I'm really sorry to disappoint those of you that love that old discussion about what's the difference between mentoring and coaching. It cropped up again on Tuesday. I'm not going to go there except to say that I take coaching to be one of a number of potential roles of the mentor, and one that relates to attempts to support an individual's development of one or more job-specific skills or capabilities. That's mentoring, and that's what I mean by early career teacher. Those undertaking initial teacher preparation programs, also known as initial teacher training or initial teacher education, or in their first 3 years of members of the teaching profession. Coming back to the definition of mentoring that I provided, this extends my own previous definitions and those of others by explicitly referring to the need to support mentees' well-being. Why is this? I think early career teachers' well-being and employees' well-being more generally is important, and that mentors should be concerned about this for a variety of reasons, some of the more important ones being listed here. Personally, I'm of the belief, and I'm sure you all are too, that humans' well-being, and therefore employees' well-being, is an important goal in its own right. But even on purely instrumental grounds, research shows that employees, in this case early career teachers, with enhanced well-being, tend to be more motivated, more committed to the organisation, more effective, and more likely to remain with the organisation and in the profession. Mentors are particularly well placed to have a significant positive impact on employees' well-being. But if mentoring isn't done right, mentors can also detract from mentees' well-being. There are also specific reasons to be concerned about the well-being of early career teachers in particular, one being that they may be generally regarded as potentially vulnerable learners for a number of reasons, including those effectively summarised by Rachel Shanks recently. I'll give you a moment to read this quotation. I think it provides a powerful insight into the experiences of early career teachers and why they might appreciate and benefit from the support of a supportive mentor. I'll go on later to illustrate how the vulnerabilities of early career teachers, explained by these difficult transitions that Shanks refers to, sometimes reveal themselves in their experiences of learning to teach and becoming a teacher. First, I'll provide a brief outline of the research that informs the arguments and claims that I'm going to make today. So the lecture and its constituent arguments is informed firstly by 6 in particular of numerous empirical studies that colleagues and I have undertaken between 2003, feels a long time ago, and 2016. Secondly, by reviews of the international evidence base, on mentoring in general, and since Angie Maldras and I introduced the concept to the evidence base in 2013, on judgementoring in particular. And thirdly, by personal communications with other academics relating to the phenomenon of judgementoring, primarily exchanges through the medium of ResearchGate. Beyond these brief details of the 6 empirical projects listed here, I won't cover any of this in more detail. If anyone's interested, I'm happy to share and send further information on this and anything else I'm talking about today. So I'll give my email address at the end. Just to say that across the first 5 projects listed there, my co-researchers and I surveyed around 3,750 teachers, mostly early career teachers in primary, secondary and further education, 2,000 of these on an annual basis over a 5-year period, and conducted interviews or focus groups with around 140 early career teachers and over 60 mentors. And in the most recent study there, the Mentoring Across Professions project, we carried out a review of literature on organisational mentoring more generally, and then case studies of 10 work-based mentoring schemes across 6 different countries, schemes which had been identified amongst key stakeholders and experts in the field as being exemplary schemes which had significant impact. So whilst most of the research has focused on mentoring for the professional learning and development of teachers and early career teachers in particular, some of what I'm about to say is informed by mentoring across a range of sectors, including HR, the police service, business, and professional football refereeing. I've referred several times to colleagues, and before going any further, I must acknowledge the valuable contributions of all my co-researchers and co-authors on the various projects undertaken between 2001 and the present day, which have informed this lecture and my associated works. Whilst in total they're too numerous to mention, there are 3 in particular, 3 external colleagues with whom I've worked on and off for 15 to 20 years and who were each involved in more than one of the informing research projects. And they were Professor Peter Tomlinson, Emeritus Professor of Pedagogy and Professional Learning at the University of Leeds, who was my PhD supervisor, Dr. Angie Maldras, who was co-investigator on the Becoming a Teacher study and with whom I co-authored the original article on judgementoring, and Pat Ashby, amongst other things. Pat co-authored the paper Reality Aftershock, which I also refer to today. Turning to University of Brighton colleagues who I've worked with since coming here in 2014, Kerry Doyle, who joins us today, thanks for coming, Kerry, was a valued co-researcher on both the mentoring in further education and mentoring across profession studies, and Patricia Castanera, who's also here, likewise on the mentoring across profession study, and is also working with David Stevens and myself on a separate ongoing in-progress research and development project on teacher mentoring in Kenya, funded by the Aga Khan Foundation. I'm also hugely grateful to the funders of the various research projects on teacher mentoring and early professional development that colleagues and I have undertaken, including the ESRC, the Department for Education under various guises, the then Teacher Training Agency and General Teaching Council for England, the then National College for School Leadership. I've been a little concerned about this the then trend, and especially the Gatsby Charitable Foundation, who I'm sure have more longevity, and who funded 3 of the 6 projects that I listed there, which are informing my lecture today. Gatsby have been a major champion of mentoring and teachers' early professional development, especially in the area of science education. And the work they've done and we've done together has had a significant impact in this area. Thanks in particular to Jenny French and Jennifer Burden at Gatsby, who have been fantastic to work with, and I'm delighted to say that Jenny joins us today. Angie Maldras and Peter Tomlinson, who I mentioned earlier, have acted as extremely supportive informal mentors to me over the years, but I've had less contact with them recently, as Peter's retired and Angie's mostly retired. And since coming to Brighton, I seem to have adopted another informal mentor in Lorraine Harrison. And Lorraine doesn't seem to mind too much. She isn't the only one. There are a number of you who have been extremely supportive, and I greatly value that. Lorraine's valued support and wisdom comes free of charge, assuming you don't count a large glass of Pinot Grigio. Finally, a huge thanks to Katie Warrener and everybody else associated with organising this event, including Andrew Carter, the senior chef, who created the fantastic vegetarian canapé, and Debbie King, the campus hospitality manager, who sourced the vegan wine that I'm looking forward to sampling sooner rather than later. So without further ado, mentoring for early career teachers. Close but no cigar. I won't dwell on this, but provide here a brief history of the introduction of formal mentoring programs into teacher preparation and new teacher induction programs in schools and colleges in the UK. A lot of you will be familiar with this. I think the key point to make here is that in the great scheme of things, in the history of mentoring in organisations, its widespread introduction to the teaching profession for student and newly qualified teachers in the 1990s in schools and the early years of the 21st century in FE is a relatively recent phenomenon. And I would argue that its introduction and deployment has not been especially informed by what has been learned from the experience of mentoring in other sectors, which partly explains the rationale for the recent Mentoring Across Professions study that Jenny and I and Jennifer Burden dreamt up, not far away from where we are today. It's also important to note that student teachers and NQTs routinely have mentors, relatively few teachers have mentors after their newly qualified teacher induction period. They use more selectively, and I'll say a little bit about that later. What about the rationale then for the rise of mentoring in teacher education? I think the rationale has varied over time and between different stakeholder groups and different contexts. There's no definitive account of this, and it's difficult to get insights into this in some cases. For some, the key driver is educational, insofar as mentoring was and is seen as a way of supporting the learning and development of student and newly qualified teachers. And this notion found support in a range of influential perspectives on professional knowledge and its acquisition. Two listed there: reflective practitioner approaches, situated learning, also cognitive psychology of skill, various socio-cultural theories, all being influential there. It also seems that policymakers initiating what might be called the second phase or government-led expansion of mentoring in England and some parts of the United States were influenced by its potential to alleviate what was known as reality shock associated with the transition from student teacher to qualified teacher, as new teachers came to terms with the realities of a full or relatively full timetable and pupil in discipline without the protection that initial teacher preparation provides. And related to this, mentoring was seen by some as a panacea for high levels of attrition amongst teachers in their first 3 years in the profession. At some stage, it was also considered in some contexts that mentors could also perform a gatekeeping function, gatekeeper to the profession, contributing to the assessment of student and NQTs to ensure their teaching is of a sufficiently high standard. And more recently, mentoring and coaching have been used in some schools and colleges in a more targeted way to attempt to improve the performance of teachers and lecturers of any career stage whose performance who've been judged to be underperforming in Ofsted terms. So if those were some of the reasons why formalised teacher mentoring has been introduced, what does the research tell us about its impact? The international research evidence tells us that the potential gains of mentoring early career teachers are substantial. Mentoring's been found to be one of the most effective means of supporting teachers' early professional learning and development. That's the second abbreviation, PLD, Professional Learning and Development. Mentoring benefits early career teachers in other ways too, as I'll show shortly, and has additional benefits for mentors and organisations. I'll briefly highlight the main research findings then. Benefits for mentees. Mentoring's been found to help early career teachers improve various skills, including those of classroom and behaviour management, self-reflection and problem solving, to increase their confidence and self-esteem, to reduce feelings of isolation, and to reduce NQT's experiences of reality shock, as some had hoped. And largely in consequences of these various benefits, early career teachers who are mentored are less likely to leave the profession than those who are not. I won't dwell on these given time constraints, but research has identified significant gains too from mentoring others for mentors themselves. The potential benefits to mentors are shown there. Interestingly, some research suggests that mentors sometimes get more out of a mentoring relationship than mentees. And as a result of the various benefits for mentees and mentors, organisations have been found to benefit from, for example, improved retention of teachers, both mentees and mentors. And as a result of the enhanced learning and development of their teachers, from enhanced learning for their students or pupils. So they're all the potential benefits. Back to the bad news. Despite sporadic evidence of excellent practice, and I would stress that I'm aware of excellent mentoring practice in some of the schools and colleges in our region, and nationally and internationally, despite that, in general, mentoring for early career teachers is failing to realise its potential, seriously failing to realise its potential. On the one hand, the potential positive impacts are not always realised, and on the other, in some cases, mentoring is actually disadvantageous and harmful. It can stunt teachers' professional learning and development in various ways, and I'm not sure whether any of the types of teacher depicted in Pink Floyd's The Wall still exist. They did in my school days. But there is also evidence that mentoring can and does lead to the promotion and reproduction of conventional norms and practices that we wouldn't necessarily want to be promoted and reproduced, and in doing so impedes early career teachers' use of more progressive teaching methodologies. And mentoring can and sometimes does detrimentally impact early career teachers' well-being and contribute to some early career teachers' decisions to leave the profession. So why is this? Research, my own and that of others, has identified a variety of reasons why mentoring for early career teachers has not been an unmitigated success. Amongst these, it's been found that mentors often have insufficient time to devote to supporting mentees, workload issues. Many schools and colleges do not employ sufficiently rigorous methods of mentor selection, and mentors are not provided with appropriate mentor preparation and development opportunities. And these and other issues can be attributed to some extent to mentoring not having sufficient status or being insufficiently funded. And I would say that the research is pretty unanimous on those first 5 points listed there. And further, most, if not all of those first 5 points are now acknowledged in one or other of both of the 2015 Carter Review of Initial Teacher Training that some of you will be familiar with and David referred to earlier, and the new 2016 National Standards for School-Based Initial Teacher Training. But the next point isn't. And there isn't unanimity amongst researchers on this point, with some arguing that it is possible for mentors to effectively combine support and formal assessment and evaluation roles. I agree it is possible. For some mentors, working with some mentees with particular kinds of mindsets and dispositions in some contexts. But the research my colleagues and I have undertaken shows that mentors having to undertake a formal assessment role, and mentees being aware of this, as they are, provides a significant obstacle to productive mentoring relationships that many are unable to overcome. It significantly stacks the odds against the establishment of an open, trusting relationship, which is necessary if we're to realise the various potential benefits of mentorship. I will illustrate this through a discussion of the phenomenon of judgementoring. First, a definition. So this is how Angie Maldorez and I defined judgementoring, which we found to be widely practiced with student teachers and newly qualified teachers in primary and secondary schools in England. We considered it an inappropriate enactment of mentoring. I'll give you a chance to read it. The start of the definition is similar to the earlier one, that mentoring ought to be. But here, the mentor, in revealing too readily and or too often his or her own judgments on or evaluation of the mentee's planning and teaching, compromises the mentoring relationship and its potential benefits. We considered that an inappropriate enactment of mentoring because the mentoring, if you could call it that, was unnecessarily evaluative, judgmental, and directive, which our analyses found to impede to impede early career teachers' professional learning and development and well-being. So as you may have guessed, I coined the term judgementoring to capture the notion of judgmental mentoring, which, to the extent that some of the literature on mentoring tells us that mentoring ought to be non-judgmental, might be considered something of an oxymoron. If it's judgmental, it's arguably not mentoring. Judgementoring is typified in many mentors' over-reliance on an excessive use of the strategy of observing and providing feedback on mentees' lessons. For some mentors, this practice is almost synonymous with mentoring, when in fact, as I'm sure many of you will be aware, there's a wide range of additional and alternative non-judgmental and non-directive approaches to supporting a mentee's learning, development and well-being. To the extent that it provides a trustworthy representation of reality, the quotation from the mentor here, provided here, illustrates what we might call nice judgementoring. The mentor demonstrates a concern for the beginner teacher's well-being and professional development. I make them feel there are some good things. Nonetheless, the mentor focused on providing her or his own evaluation of the mentee's lesson and presenting the mentee with her or his own strategies for points that need to be addressed based on her or his own judgments, experience and pedagogical insights, rather than facilitating and scaffolding the mentee's own critical reflection on their teaching attempt, which might have elicited some valuable developmental points and might have been more empowering for the mentee. Furthermore, there's evidence that not all mentors appear to share this mentor's concern for early career teachers' well-being. Some early career teachers recounted experiences of mentors who they suggested dealt almost exclusively in negative judgments. And some quotations there which go some way towards illustrating that point. Angie and I initially identified judgementoring in relation to early career teachers in primary and secondary schools in England, and a number of other researchers have subsequently confirmed its prevalence in the schools and FE sectors in England, and in a range of other contexts, including the United States, Cyprus, Norway, and New Zealand, some of which are illustrated in the brief quotations presented here. These and other research findings may suggest that judgementoring has become more widespread in recent years. But as with the debate about whether rising crime rates are synonymous with rising crime, it may just be that we're better at detecting it, or now that it's on the agenda, more researchers are noticing and reporting it. Nonetheless, I hypothesize that we may be witnessing a period of what I'd like to call global judgementoring creep, connected to the spread of what Stephen Ball calls the terrors of performativity, and Pazzi Salberg refers to as the global education reform movement, GERM. I'll now elaborate on why all this is a problem. It's clear from my own and others' research that the practice of judgementoring impedes the development of safe and trusting relationships between mentors and mentees. Related to this, judgementoring is detrimental to mentees' professional learning and development, insofar as my colleague Joe McIntyre and I found that it encouraged teachers to engage in two distinct forms of fabrication. The first, which is both unfortunate and ironic insofar as mentors are supposed to be there primarily to support their professional learning and development, is that the judgmental and evaluative nature of the mentoring makes some and many early career teachers reluctant to be open and honest with their mentors about their perceived professional learning and development needs, the very thing that mentors might be able to help with directly or indirectly by referring them to someone who can. And we call this fabrication as strategic silence. Secondly, further to not actually seeking help with their perceived weaknesses or development needs, a related form of fabrication that we discovered involved mentees, early career teachers, avoiding activities which might nonetheless draw attention to those perceived weaknesses. For example, by encouraging mentors to observe classes where their classroom and behaviour management strategies were working, rather than those where they were not. The two types of fabrication and impediments to early career teachers' professional learning and development are illustrated on the next slide by quotations from two early career teachers. I think this first one, illustrating fabrication as strategic silence, speaks for itself. The quotations are actually two there from the same early career teacher for the second type. These relate to an early career teacher who lacked confidence in elements of her subject knowledge. I remember interviewing this particular early career teacher, and as a result of this, actually avoided dealing with those areas directly in her teaching, which she described as putting subject knowledge to the back. So we can see early career teachers going to quite elaborate lengths to avoid drawing attention to the things that they need help with, because they're concerned to present an appearance of competence and fear the consequences of any perceived weaknesses being discovered, rather than actually declaring and seeking help with these, which will be better for everyone. On to the other consequences of judgementoring. The relatively directive nature of judgementoring and the associated lack of autonomy that it affords mentees can result in early career teachers becoming over-reliant on their mentors and developing a form of learned helplessness. In turn, this impedes mentees' development of the important skills of critical reflection in and on practice and of learnercy, which I mentioned earlier. Teachers' ability to manage their ongoing learning from their own and others' subsequent experiences of teaching. Hence, Marie Cameron and colleagues note that examples of judgementoring found in their New Zealand study led to mentees relying on mentor judgments at the expense of thinking critically about their own practice. And the last consequences of judgementoring that I wanted to mention, it impedes early career teachers' well-being, as illustrated there in a quotation from Rachel Lofthouse and Ulrika Thomas's research, getting disheartened about things you've done as a result of mentors judging you. Pat Ashby and I found that it contributed to reality aftershock, which we described as difficulties experienced by recently qualified teachers in consequence of a sudden reduction in support when their NQT mentor was no longer available. And that was the case because the mentor was too directive and they weren't prepared for life without a mentor. And all of that can also impact and does and has also impacted on trainee and teacher retention. In a study that I did some additional analysis on the Becoming a Teacher data with Louise Tracy and Gary Chambers, we found that those student teachers who withdrew from initial teacher preparation programs invariably mentioned poor relationships with mentors and the receipt of mentor feedback that they regarded as unduly negative and critical. Okay, so having discussed the consequences of judgementoring, what are the main causes? This is by no means an exhaustive account, but I want to highlight today four major and somewhat interconnected causes. First, my evidence suggests that a, and probably the major cause of judgementoring, is the fact that many, and perhaps most schools and colleges that provide early career teachers with mentors, assign those mentors to what I referred earlier as the conflicting roles of formally evaluating and assessing the beginner teachers on the one hand and supporting their professional learning and development on the other. In some cases, this is compounded where early career teachers' mentors are also their line managers or supervisors, a role which necessarily requires formal evaluation of their work. It's noteworthy that in the 10 case studies of exemplary work-based mentoring schemes undertaken for the Mentoring Across Professions project that I mentioned earlier, we found no evidence of judgementoring, and mentoring was exclusively offline, that is, separated from mentees' line management. And mentors and coaches had no involvement in the formal evaluation of their mentees' performance in any of those schemes. The mentoring scheme induction brochure of one of those case studies, the English Football Association referee mentoring scheme, explicitly addresses the rationale for mentoring being offline in the quotation provided there, enabling a more fully open relationship. And some of the ways in which online mentoring can compromise the mentoring relationship are explained by a senior police officer interviewed for another of the case studies in the mentoring across professions study. The mentee or coachee in this terms, the programme was referred to as a coaching scheme but met our definition of mentoring, effectively said that if her mentor had been her line manager or involved in assessing or evaluating her work, she too would be engaging in fabrication as strategic silence, as the early career teachers we research had been doing. Second cause of judgementoring then, second contributory factor, is particularly apparent in the findings of the Mentoring in FE project that Kerry and I were involved in with colleagues from Sheffield Hallam University, which showed that apart from allocating mentors to trainee and newly qualified teachers, which is standard practice, many FE institutions, and I believe from colleagues that this applies to schools as well, selectively employ mentoring or coaching as a remedial strategy to address perceived underperformance of teachers. In particular, those who were judged through lesson observations to be grade 3 requires improvement or 4 inadequate in Ofsted terms. In such a scenario, both early career and more experienced teachers will naturally associate mentoring with evaluations of and judgments on their teaching. Furthermore, such a scenario encourages a stigma to be attached to being mentored, which is likely to exacerbate the tendency towards fabrication as strategic silence and strategic avoidance, as the quotation there suggests. Mentoring being perceived as a bad thing. Are they coming to pick on me? The third broad cause of judgementoring is that in some education systems, perhaps most notably our own, the practice at institutional level of involving mentors in the formal monitoring, assessment and evaluation of their mentees' teaching is actually encouraged, if not required, by national policy diktat. Although I think it contains a loophole which enables the conflicting roles to be carried out by different people, the quotation provided here from our Department for Education's statutory guidance for schools on the induction of newly qualified teachers illustrates the conflation of the support and developmental roles of mentoring and coaching on the one hand, and the quality assurance and quality control roles of monitoring and assessment on the other. The DFE's decision to accept the recommendation of the 2015 Carter Review of Initial Teacher Training to establish national standards for mentoring and ITT at least provided an opportunity to address this significant problem. And I said this directly to the group charged by the DFE with establishing the standards, the Teaching Schools Council, and I provided them with research evidence which showed it to be the right thing to do. But the chair, Gary Holden, suggested that to tackle this would be beyond the remit of the group. So whilst there's much to applaud about the new standards, on this particular issue, they've served to entrench what I believe to be the most serious impediment to realising the potential of school-based mentoring for early career teachers. And on the next slide, I provide an excerpt from the standards, which includes the offending article. So the good news is that the standards stress the importance of initial and ongoing mentor development and training. The bad news is that this clearly includes training for mentors in formally assessing, evaluating and passing judgment on the standard of their mentees' teaching, which, I profess again, compromises the mentoring relationship and impedes the learning promotion potential of mentorship, as well as its various other potential benefits. There are a number of other likely contributory factors too. One is the broader trend in recent years towards performativity, which tends to put as much, if not more, emphasis and resource into monitoring, measuring, assessing and reporting on teacher and school effectiveness than on effective means of enhancing any of these things. Another is that research has shown that many schools and colleges do not employ rigorous methods of mentor selection based on appropriate selection criteria such as potential to provide non-judgmental support. But the fourth and last major cause of judgementoring that I want to highlight today is the frequent absence, well established in the mentoring literature, of appropriate provision for mentor education and training. As Kate Thornton argued in relation to her own research on the mentoring of beginner teachers in New Zealand, without in-depth professional learning opportunities, mentors are likely to revert to telling the beginner teacher what to do or being overcritical, which are associated with judgementoring, rather than engage in more developmental mentoring activities. And on the other hand, Ellie Legenberg and colleagues at the University of Oslo found in a quantitative study that where appropriate opportunities for mentor preparation and development are provided, mentor education contributes to lower reported levels of beliefs consistent with judgementoring, though their research didn't allow them to go on to establish whether those non-judgementoring beliefs were translated into non-judgementoring practices. So having outed and identified the drawbacks and harmful consequences of judgementoring, and armed by my research and that of colleagues with an understanding of its causes, I felt somewhat morally obliged and wanted to offer up something that might help to bring about a better state of affairs. More positive mentoring futures, if I might borrow some terminology from the new research plan, strategic plan. And notwithstanding the preponderance of research on teacher mentoring, it could be argued that one of the reasons why policymakers and many school and college leaders and individual mentors have got it so wrong in presiding over the terrors of judgementoring is the lack of a specific research-informed framework for the mentoring of early career teachers. So in the final part of this lecture, I briefly outline a new mentoring framework for mentoring, which I call ONSIDE Mentoring, which I'm convinced would enable policymakers, school and college leaders, and others who have responsibility towards early career teachers to avoid judgementoring and its harmful consequences, and to have a stronger chance of maximising the various potential benefits of mentorship. So ONSIDE Mentoring is informed first by my own and others' empirical research on what's wrong with teacher mentoring and what's right with effective mentoring in other sectors. And I've summarised some of the key pertinent research today. Secondly, by a number of theories of and approaches to mentoring, coaching and professional learning and development. And thirdly, by theories of human motivation and well-being, notably self-determination theory. I briefly outlined the main informing theories and make no apology for the fact that some of these have been around for some time. I think one of the problems of education today is that the tendency to jump on new bandwagons and throw out old ideas, and the new ideas are not necessarily any better than the old ones. So ONSIDE draws on, is informed by, and is consistent with developmental approaches to mentoring and reflective practitioner approaches to professional learning and development, throats just about holding out, which seek to empower mentees and promote their learnership, with growth and compassion-based approaches to mentoring and coaching, which assume that mentees and coachees, in this case early career teachers, have the capacity for self-reflection and growth, and with the theory of scaffolding, the socio-cultural learning metaphor for the contingent support for an individual's learning and development provided by someone more experienced or adept at what they're seeking to learn or develop. ONSIDE mentoring is also informed by the influential theory of human motivation and well-being self-determination theory, which some of you will doubtless be familiar with. It tells us that human motivation and well-being are enhanced when innate psychological needs for competence, relatedness and autonomy are satisfied, and diminished when such needs are thwarted. Where competence relates to the sense of efficacy that individuals have in relation to the various tasks in which they're engaged, relatedness to the feeling that one is closely connected to or cared for by others, and autonomy to the experience of volition that can accompany an act, as opposed to that of external control. So on to slightly more specifically what ONSIDE mentoring involves, though in simple terms it represents the polar opposite of judgementoring and the factors bringing it about. It comprises what I consider to be 7 key imperatives of mentoring schemes and mentoring relationships. And the overriding imperative of ONSIDE mentoring is that, as its name suggests, mentors are first and foremost on the side of, supporters champions and advocates for their mentees. Early career teachers' status as vulnerable learners provides a moral as well as practical imperative that someone takes their side and that they are allocated a supporter in whom they can place their trust. ONSIDE mentoring is thus part predicated on the research-informed assumption that establishing relational trust is pivotal to the success of the mentoring relationship and therefore to enhancing mentees' learning, development and well-being. And this is encouraged by the 6 imperatives that follow. Mentoring must be offline. It shouldn't occur within hierarchical and power relationships which make it difficult to establish relational trust and for mentees to openly share their professional learning and development needs. Interestingly, in most of the exemplary mentoring schemes colleagues and I examined for the Mentoring Across Professions study, the mentors were external to the organisation in which the mentee was employed. Secondly, mentoring must be non-judgmental and non-evaluative. Thirdly, must be supportive of mentees' psychosocial needs and well-being. Fourthly, individualised, tailored to the specific needs and changing needs, emotional as well as developmental, of the mentee, not one size fits all. It must be developmental and growth orientated, seeking to promote mentees' learnership and provide them with appropriate degrees of challenge. It must not be deployed as a remedial strategy, as a targeted remedial strategy to correct perceived deficiencies in professional practice, which can discourage mentees from taking advantage of the support of mentors and encourage them to fabricate their professional learning and development needs. And it must be empowering, progressively non-directive, to support mentees to become more autonomous and agentic. So mentoring should not normally be directive, in which mentors provide solutions rather than supporting mentees to find their own, and which accords mentees little autonomy and agency, and encourages their dependency on the mentor. I say progressively non-directive because the experience of non-directive forms of mentoring can initially be potentially stressful for some early career teachers, as lots of colleagues around the room will know, as can the provision of appropriate degrees of challenge which encourage them out of their comfort zones. It will therefore sometimes be necessary, in order to support early career teachers' emotional and psychological needs and well-being, for mentors to adopt a relatively directive approach to mentoring at the outset of the relationship. But ONSIDE mentoring is progressively autonomy promoting and progressively challenging, seeking to promote mentees' professional learning and development and learnership to the extent that this is consistent with ensuring they're not exposed to too much stress or too many potential impediments to their well-being. There will be some challenges of implementation of ONSIDE mentoring. For example, identifying separate colleagues to act as early career teachers' supporters on the one hand and undertake the assessment and evaluation role on the other may be a challenge for smaller schools where there are a limited number of suitable colleagues. But I don't think this and other potential issues are insurmountable. And like all mentoring schemes, one based upon the ONSIDE mentoring framework will be more likely to flourish where efforts are made to ensure various other conditions for effective mentoring, some of which I identified earlier, are provided, and I list some of those here. Not least, appropriate provision for mentor preparation and development will be key, and such provision should include an explicit focus on the range of factors which impact early career teachers' professional learning and development and their well-being, and means of developing and maintaining trusting relationships, as well as the various other imperatives of ONSIDE mentoring, such as how to practice non-directive and non-judgmental mentoring. If institutions get all this right, I contend that ONSIDE mentoring would help combat judgementoring and its various unfavourable consequences. For example, by ensuring mentees do not become too dependent on their mentors, but instead are empowered and become increasingly autonomous, thus helping reduce the likelihood of reality aftershock. And ONSIDE mentoring would help schools and colleges to realise the various potential benefits of mentoring for mentees, mentors, and their institutions, some of which are listed here. Drawing to a close, I urge everyone to join me in seeking to root out judgementoring. And I commend ONSIDE Mentoring to you, noting too that, well informed by my own and others' research on early career teachers in particular, ONSIDE Mentoring is also informed by and wholly consistent with our research on exemplary mentoring and coaching programs across various professions and sectors in 6 different countries. As such, the framework may be of interest and potentially applicable in other contexts, perhaps especially with respect to early career professionals who, like teachers, may generally be regarded as vulnerable learners. Please contact me at that email address if you'd like any further information relating to any of the things that I've talked about. If you're potentially interested in being part of a future research and development project trialling and evaluating ONSIDE mentoring, or if you or your institution may be willing and able to provide financial support for such a project, or you know someone who might, or if there's anything else that you'd like to share or discuss, I'd like to finish by saying a big thank you again for coming and for listening. Apologies if I've overrun slightly. And may I now introduce Dr. John Smith, Head of the School of Education at the University of Brighton, to close the ceremony.